We're currently living in a world where big tech is really starting to take over if it hasn't already. I'm Beth Motter here for ZDNet. I'm with Ray Wang, the principal analyst, founder, and chairman of Silicon Valley based Constellation Research. Ray, we kind of want to get started. First things first, I'm really interested in your take on big tech infrastructure, its current role in society and politics.
Beth, it's a great point, right? Big tech infrastructure is everywhere. We take it for granted all over the place. The cloud, right? You access your app. You can actually download a file. You're being protected. You make a transaction. You jump in and hail a cab, or when we could in the past, or you just order food and have it delivered to your home. That's all tech infrastructure. And over the past 20 years, that tech infrastructure has scaled. One of the big things is the cloud. And what the cloud has done is allow us to take for granted where that data sits, where the compute processing located, and even how you make a change to an app or subscribe to app or pay. That's all taken for granted.
Yeah, I don't think we fully realize how immersed we've become until you take a step back and all of those things you listed. I mean, we are using those things every single day. And I know we hold these devices. You and I are communicating over the phone, over the internet. This will be stored to the cloud. It's just insane how often we're using it. But so jumping from the cloud a little bit over, can you break down how Twitter, Facebook, AWS, everything that's really relevant right now in the world are able to ban users, companies, and services?
Well, if you remember signing up for any of these services, which nobody does, right? You check that little box that said, okay, I agree. I've consented to everything. And boom, suddenly you're like, oh, shoot, what is that in my TOS? And no one's ever been called out on the TOS until something bad happens. Like you say something no one likes, or you do something egregious, or you forget your password, or you forget to pay your bill. Boom, you get cut off. Right. That's what TOS is, terms of service. And that's in every one of those things that you just check and ignore. I know a few people that read them, but most people don't. Right. And so that's part of this, right, that we're seeing, right? Use Twitter. I'm using social media. I'm using Gab. I'm using Parler. Or I can't use that anymore, but you get the idea, right? The point being is that could go away. Now, there's terms of services for us as individuals. And there's term of services for the businesses that use their services on top of that. And there's always escape clauses. There's always out clauses. It's just like sports contracts. You say something bad or you're not representing the brand and boom, you get cut off, right? That's the same thing when we use these apps. Now, here's the challenge. You cannot personally go deliver your own social network. That requires someone else to do that. And they sit on someone else's infrastructure, which are the cloud players. And there's really three major cloud players everybody uses: Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And there are a few other ones that are out there. Or you can try to host that yourself, but it gets expensive very fast, right? And this is akin to back when we only had like one telco company, right? We then ended up with a couple. We have a couple mobile providers. The problem is we are extremely dependent on these cloud services.
Yeah, the really big companies are now, they're just taking over. And so these cloud companies, what can we do moving forward? What how do we keep from being silenced on, these one, two, three platforms when that's really all we have? How do we break that up?
Yeah, actually, a very interesting question. There is a dependency on the cloud vendors, and the idea is to have more competitors, right? We've seen over the years that Microsoft has been the viable number two versus Amazon. Google's gotten serious, competing as to be the number three player, and then all across the world, we basically really only have one or two players. Now, part of the reason is the expense of actually running a data center. You've got to build capacity before anybody needs it, and continuously add capacity as people jump in and use your services. And so it's a pretty expensive proposition. It's like running a telecom network. That's why some countries only have two players, others have three. It's not an easy thing to do. So that's part of it. To get out of that, and that's one of the challenges we face, is these digital giants are in a position of massive power. They can turn you on or turn you off. We've seen some evidence of what that could look like now. But think about it the other way. If a hacker decides to take out one of these networks, or if one of these networks goes away, goes bankrupt, what happens to the rest of society? And so right now we're heavily dependent on for-profit entities to be able to go do that. Like other utilities in the future, they may become heavily regulated over time, just like power, just like water. Like people aren't competing to provide you. Well, they are now. We got solar, right? But you get the idea. When we have things that are kind of calm, kind of centralized, kind of stable, we see a lot of regulation coming, and we see it as a public utility and a public utility for good. Now, you can always generate your own power. start up a gas powered generator, or create a solar battery array. You could do that on your own and have your own power. And if you truly want freedom, you're going to have to want to generate your own internet or create your own cloud services provider. But also keep in mind the backbone which it runs on, the internet, is also regulated in some countries. That's why with the Great Firewall in China. That's why other countries are trying to restrict what type of content comes in and out. And so you got that kind of in. We live in an open and free society, right? There's rights, there's privileges, and there's responsibilities, and all that gets mixed into these larger discussions.
Yeah, so you briefly touched on it. Our rights, our constitution, like this is where we live, that's what we've been given versus some other company or countries, excuse me. Would you say that the banning of individuals, of companies on these different public service platforms, these social medias, is that a violation of Americans' First Amendment rights?
Well, in the legal context, the answer is no. These are private marketplaces. These are private squares. These are private communities. They can do whatever they want, right? If there's any grounds here, it might be thinking about the fact that the laws might have been applied unfairly. You've been targeted. That could get you maybe legally to a discrimination suit, maybe, right? And the fact that these terms of services are pretty clear, like if you violate this, but how come you didn't do this for this other person? Okay, fine. That's the argument that you could get at a legal ground. On the other hand, right, you could also say that, you know, if you continue to do something like this and you see how vulnerable we are, we might want to think about alternatives, because if something bad does happen and an individual isn't able to say something, there is, a First Amendment issue. But the First Amendment issue is coming from a different place. It's coming from potentially collusion, right? Everybody jumped in and locked me out. Okay, but you have to prove that that collusion occurred, and it's very hard in this case. So I think there's no legal grounds here. I don't think First Amendment rights are being challenged, but I think there's a larger conversation about First Amendment rights, what's politically correct, a cancel culture, and thinking about in general, like what it means if people are being silenced. And I think that's the broader issue. But to say that, shutting down a social media network is bad, it's a First Amendment right issue, is nuanced. It's not true. It's a private marketplace. Right. If that private marketplace was taken away, then we have different things. But remember, we do regulate media companies. We do regulate other areas. And I think we're going to start figuring out what we want to do with these social media giants over time.
Yeah, I mean, we're 100% in unprecedented times. It's been interesting watching it quickly unravel. Um, a little bit looking forward to the future, a broader sense. What does this mean? Obviously, like I said, this is unprecedented. We don't know where we're going, but I mean, do we start looking towards shifting away from these privately owned companies? What do you think the next step is? What do you think our future holds?
Well, I'm actually writing a book on that, and essentially it's done. It comes out in July of this year. Would say that we're going to go through phases of these digital giants. We're in the beginning. We're in the rise of digital giants. They're getting big. They're getting happy, right? And at some point, we're going to get to the height of these digital giants, where we're somewhere close, where they're still doing a lot of innovation. They're still providing lots of free services. They're still collecting a lot of our data. They're still mining that data. They're using it for other goods. And then at some point, the investor sentiment's going to drop. They can't spend as much money on innovation. People are going to be upset at them for a million different reasons. And then we get into a decline, and then, the dawn of those digital giants. We've got 10 years to play. There's 10 years to go in this. And part of it, as we see that, that maybe we regulate them, maybe we look at them in a different way. But I think this issue is going to come back really about what kind of powers will they have, because technology is infused in every part of our life, as we talked about. And it's very hard to divorce ourselves from that technology in any manner. One of the things that you could actually fight at a conceptual level is the right to be disconnected. Think about how hard that would be today. I'm going to be completely disconnected. Don't call me. Everything has to be analog. A company has to send me a letter. A company has to actually pay in cash, right? I got to do all these things that take me off the digital network. You can't track my phone number, right? So it's going to be interesting to see what happens if we can have that choice to actually be disconnected and not be digital, and if that's something that becomes one part of our rights. Now, on the other hand, there's a big war on the data that's going on with these social companies and these digital giants. The question is, who owns that data? There's a number of people that have been talking about this, right? One of my friends, Richie at Waru, was out there talking about the fact that data should be a property right. It's interesting. Your personal data, your genomic information, all the social media, digital exhaust, that becomes your personal data. And somebody wants to use it, they have to ask for consent to use it. And then, of course, there's things that are public good. So I could loan you my data. Here's all my health data. I'm going to donate it to the American Cancer Society. Here's what you might pay for one-time use for my data, or I'm going to give you all my data across, my life. You can have it in exchange for these services. So we may get to that kind of exchange mechanism as well.
The possibilities. I'm still reeling. I've never thought about going completely off the grid. Like I'm thinking about my job, my, just connecting with friends, especially right now in a pandemic, my cell phone, my utilities, like everything that I use, that had never crossed my mind. And for that to maybe be something we're looking towards, does that does that feel like a step back in like technology and what we're doing, or does that come across as things are getting too powerful, this is a necessary step? How do you view that?
Look, you and I are tech aficionados. That's why we're in this business. And, that seems impossible. You're like, hey, how are you going to do that? It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But think about it. Have you ever been at the airline gate when the boarding system dies? Right? There's always a few people that know actually how to process a manual ticket. I mean, it's kind of funny, right? They're counting the tickets. They're making sure it's possible. It's cumbersome. It's cumbersome, but that will be the populist backlash on the fact with big tech getting bigger. Can we actually go off and be off the grid and officially off the grid? That doesn't solve the problem, right? On the other end of the spectrum is the fact of making all your personal data, what we talked about, a property right. And the reason you want to do property rights, you have land rights, you have intellectual property for ideas. Well, your data is the crux of all these businesses. And there's got to be a way to reclaim that or take that to the individual. Now, governments aren't necessarily going to agree to that easier because they want their cut, right? So they're going to want their cut as okay, how do we have that part of that data? And you need it for security and national security and defense and a whole bunch of other things, health, right? For pandemics they're tracking. So we're going to see some interesting conversations and debates around there. So somewhere in that spectrum between get me completely off the grid or ensure that my data is a property right will be there. Now, here's why. In the Constitution, there's nothing about that kind of right. So every state already has property laws. This is why it makes it work, right? Each state already has a rule governing. We don't have to create brand new legislation other than the fact that your personal data is your personal data, which is also very hard to enforce. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so much to think about. And Ray, you briefly touched on it, but this July coming up here, you have a book coming out titled "Everybody Wants to Rule the World: Surviving and Thriving in a World of Digital Giants." And you and I, before we started recording, briefly touched on. I think it's almost kind of scary that you had written this and it is ready to go in July, and all of this is happening right now. Tell us just a little bit about your book.
yeah, so the book talks about how we got here, right? And if you think about where we are, we've got a lot of digital giants. They've been highly successful. And what they've been able to do is something different. We've been talking about digital transformation and how that's going to change. I even wrote a book on that in 2015, right? This is going to change the world. Everything's going to digital. This is great. And then as we're going through this process, I suddenly realized that someone had changed the playbook. They completely changed the rules of the game. It's really about how many nodes and how many connection points you have. And what we're really doing, like in social media, we have like the business, we have a social graph that tells you what people are going to do next, how are they going to get there. And that collection of data is feeding systems that allow them to get smarter and smarter over time. These data-driven digital networks are the equivalent of business graphs, economic graphs, social graphs. And as they get built out, and as we increase the level of automation, these companies have an unfair advantage by being able to use that information, the network effects, how they're structured to pretty much take over different industries. Now, we typically think of everybody's in one industry. Like we've been having this conversation like, oh, Google's a monopoly in search, Facebook's a monopoly in advertising, and, Amazon's a monopoly in commerce. But that's only a small part of the picture. Actually, they're not technically monopolies because how they monetize information is really through digital sources: ads, search, membership, subscriptions, goods, right? These all kind of change what they are. And so they're competing for ads. So Google does 160 million in ads and Facebook does something like 70, right? And, 7 billion, sorry, 160 billion, 170 billion. And then Amazon's doing like 12 billion in ads. And the next competitors at about 1 billion, right? So they're really competing for the world of ads and monetization. They just have different ways to get there. And we used to think that everyone in the same industry is there. And so what's happening over time because of that level of competition, and back to what we talked about earlier, we have duopolies forming everywhere. And these duopolies are basically coming in. The first player takes a lot, the second player gets half of the first player, and the third player is kind of there. So, okay, look, we've got an oligopoly, right, to some extent. And this is going on in every part of our life. So if you look at an industry like it's ads or it's commerce or it's healthcare, it's financial services, that's not good enough. You have to look at the totality of actually what's happening. And I think that's what it is. So we talk about how to build your digital giant, and we also talk about what you need to do to regulate a digital giant for them to be successful, for us to ensure open markets, free markets, and equal access, or at least some access, so that the digital giants don't take over. So there's a whole chapter on regulation in there somewhere.
Well, again, super interesting, super timely. I look forward to reading it. Like I said, July 2021. It's titled Everybody Wants to Rule the World: Surviving and Thriving in a World of Digital Giants. And for Ray Wang, I'm Beth Motter. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time today. We appreciate you breaking this down for us. And be sure to stick with ZDNet for all things tech, tech regulations, and more. Thanks for watching.
Hey, thanks for having us.